25 years ago, I made a series of films about wine that saw me travel the world, building up into a history, which then became a book. Today, I thought I'd revisit it and cut it up into bite-sized chunks for you to view exclusively online. I hope you enjoyed viewing them as much as I enjoyed making them. Wine was consumed with enormous enthusiasm, as you can imagine, throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, as water was doubtful, it was really the only hygienic drink and absolutely vital to doctors. So its transport became a really important industry in its own right.
Wine was transported and stored in a two-handled clay jar called an amphora. Each kind had a slightly different shape, and a few of them, carrying the most famous wines, had the merchant's name stamped on the handle, like this one. I've always wondered how these unwieldy pieces of pottery were made in such huge numbers. A potter in Florence showed me, forming the ancient shape as though he did it every day.
That's good.
They're too big to be made in one piece, so the sections are fitted together on the potter's wheel.
Yes.
Finally, and it seems rather perversely, what was a perfectly sensible flat bottom for it to stand on is shaved away to give it a point. Why? Because the best way to give them stability was to dig their points into a bed of sand, and the point provides a grasp when you want to pour. Like a lobster, it's blue when it goes in to be cooked and comes out pink. They are very weighty things. And this one's empty. Imagine that with 35 litres of wine in it, which is what it holds, it's really a two-man proposition to lift it off the ground at all. In fact, it's not really surprising that as the Roman Empire went on, they settled for much less fragile barrels. It was sealed with a cork. They did have great big corks, and over the cork went a large amount of wax or resin, which gave a completely airtight seal. What you had, really, in effect, was one gigantic great wine bottle.
You can see exactly how the Romans appreciated wine in the time capsule town of Pompeii. On the 24th of August, 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted, covering Pompeii with a 20-foot layer of ash and preserving it for all time. I went there to have a look.
This is certainly the oldest inn sign that I've ever seen. It also seems to double as the wine list of the establishment. As far as I can make out, it is called Nola, that's the name of the place, and it offers wine in 4 qualities or varieties by the pitcher, which in Latin was by ad cucumas. In Naples today, you still ask for a cucumella if you want a pitcher of wine. They're colour-coded, so it's terribly hard to tell exactly what is on offer, or was, except by the price. And here you have one which is 4 assi, which was the unit of money. This one is 3, another one is 4, and this is the cheap one at only 2 assi. The usual, sir? There are lots of bars like this in Pompeii, in fact 2 or 3 on every block. And the usual in them consisted of what we would call today something like a wine cocktail. You could, of course, drink wine straight. If you were very smart, you drank Falernum. But most people who drank ordinary Pompeian wine remembered the saying that the hangover lasted until midday the next day. So what do we have on offer here? Ready-made in these jars, part of the bar, I have here a mixture rather like a modern vermouth in a way. It's wine flavoured with spices and herbs. This one is very, very popular because it's nice and sweet. It's got honey in it. And here, my discerning customers rather like a little seawater in their wine. Seawater? Well, the bartender's manual says if you are going to mix seawater with the wine, do go well outside the bay to collect it. And what do we drink out of? Well, this being one of the better class of Pompeii bars, we have expensive imported glassware from Syria. In fact, this is a glass carafe or decanter of the period of Pompeii, and the surprising thing about it is it weighs practically nothing. It's like a light bulb when you pick it up, so obviously it's not strong enough for aging wine, but it's very good for serving it. We don't use our best glasses like this for all our customers, but the gentlemen who intend to use the personal services that we offer upstairs can be sure of the best that my establishment can provide.
The Romans loved their wine, and so they were as keen to study and understand it as they were to party with it.
The opulence of this wine merchant's house a few doors down the street is clear enough evidence that wine was big business here. There's no doubt that Pompeii was a pretty racy town. It fits in with the cliché of Romans perpetually tottering from one orgy to another. Some people, it was said at the time, thought the human body was simply designed as a funnel for pouring away wine. So it's easy to forget that Romans were also extremely serious people. Dignity is a very Roman word. It was very dignified to be a connoisseur. The prestige of wine in ancient Rome is almost as hard to grasp today as the sheer scale and refinement of Roman luxury. In fact, there's only one place in the world you can see it today, in the flesh, so to speak, and that is here, in California. The John Paul Getty Museum at Malibu is a faithful reconstruction of one of the great villas of Herculaneum. A Roman chateau, in fact. Julius Caesar knew it well. One Roman emperor considered his greatest pleasure was tending a vineyard with his own hands.
Roman wine expertise is still useful to us today. The great naturalist Pliny wrote a precise and actually rather wonderful account of its natural history, exactly how to make it and how to appreciate it. As a distinguished old gentleman, he was put in charge of the Roman fleet at Pompeii. And when he saw an extraordinary mushroom-shaped cloud arising from Vesuvius, he thought he'd better go and have a closer look. Sadly, that was the last piece of scientific activity he undertook.
Pliny's influence certainly didn't die with him. In fact, this edition of his book was printed in 1513. That's nearly 1,500 years after he was killed. And it was still in regular use as a notebook and as a manual in vineyards and for agriculture and for all branches of natural history. This copy looks as though it's been in almost constant use since it was printed. Here's the title. Here's Pliny, Historiae Naturalis, Natural History. These look like very, very old notes by an old owner. Then there are notes in all sorts of different handwriting down the ages. Here we come to the bit where they're training vines up trees, as they still do here in the south of Italy.
Pliny actually tells us that the work was considered so dangerous that grape pickers always demanded the cost of a funeral and a decent grave in their contracts. Our other great source of information on Roman wine was a doctor who learned his profession treating wounded gladiators and rose to become personal physician to the emperor. His name was Galen. Galen's influence on medicine was so strong that right up until 200 years ago, his opinions were universally quoted. When this 18th century pharmacy was in use, Galen's prescriptions were still the standard references. The pharmacist who worked here thought Galen. And of course, all his jars were labeled in Latin. To Galen, wine was the sovereign antiseptic. It was the vehicle for administering such drugs as he had. It was the tranquilizer. And in fact, it was the basis for a healthy diet. He tasted every one of the emperor's wines himself. And in fact, he set fashions by his recommendations. He might almost have written the words of the Jewish Talmud. Wine is the foremost of all medicines. Wherever wine is lacking, drugs become necessary.
As the Roman Empire grew, it gave them different places to grow vines as well. Outside of Italy, going further north, into Gaul, now France, and into Germany. And they found that the wines grown in these places were quite different. They weren't so strong. They were drier. They called them austere. And they loved all these different flavours.
As the Romans expanded their empire northwards, they took their wine and their vines with them, across the Alpine passes to the Danube and Switzerland, and by sea across the Mediterranean to southern Gaul. The coasts of northern Italy and the south of France are littered with shipwrecks that show us the sheer scale of this trade. In a period of 100 years, some 65 million amphoras of wine were shipped from Italy to Gaul. That's well over 500,000 of these a year. Enormous jars like these were used for the bulk transport of the cheapest sorts of wine. In effect, this ship was one of the world's first tankers. From the Mediterranean, there was one obvious way north into the heart of Gaul, the valley of the River Rhone. Around its delta in Provence, the Romans built some of their greatest monuments, their aqueducts and their arenas. This arena at Arles housed no less than 20,000 spectators, and it was right on the banks of the river itself. The Rhone was the funnel through which trade and conquest and Roman culture poured into what was to become France, the land where wine was to achieve its greatest refinement. Within the period of Roman occupation, almost all of what are now the great vineyards of France were planted. The Rhone Valley, Burgundy, Bordeaux, Champagne, the Valley of the Loire. So the Romans are usually given credit for introducing wine to its future motherland.